Hello and welcome. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute. Thank you for joining us today for Economy in Plain English with Branko Milanovic, one of the world's leading economists. He has a biography so long that we could spend the whole time reading it out, as he's done so many things. So if you want a full bio, please just Google him because we want to spend the time today talking. We are here today to discuss his new book called The Great Global Transformation. But I think Branko will have one with the proper cover because I've got an early edition. I don't know if you've still got that handy, have you, Branko? No.
I
No, it's
do
probably
actually.
But he's got the
Here it
computer.
is.
hang
Brilliant.
on.
Bit higher, bit higher.
Higher, hold it up higher. Yeah, excellent.
Fantastic. So we're discussing The Great Global Transformation, which is published by Penguin Random House just a few days ago. The book looks at how the world has changed over the last 50 years. So it's the ideal book for Economy in Plain English to discuss. Economy in Plain English is brought to you by the David Hume Institute and journalist Claire English. We are on a mission to increase understanding of the economy, what it is, how it works, and all in plain English. Usually we take questions, but due to a technology blip today, it will just be Claire and I asking the question. So, Claire, let's crack on. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's lovely to be back with you. I put the plain in plain English, and I am the person that literally has never studied. Well, I studied economics a little bit, but I've never been an economics reporter. So I am very much the layman's person. I'm going to be challenging if there's some acronyms or terms that I don't understand. We're not dumbing down, we're clarifying. So, Branko, you're just the person to do this because we all need to know more about the economy, but we think it's for other people to know about. But this is important stuff. This is the stuff of everyday life. So delighted to have you with us today. And we're going to start immediately by saying the name of the book. And thank you for being here despite all the technical issues. The Great Global Transformation. It looks at how the world economy has changed in the last 50 years. And wow, how has it changed? The main idea is that we're living in a new phase of capitalism. So I'm guessing the first thing I want you to do is determine what you mean by capitalism and what's different about this new age and new phase.
Okay, well, first, thank you very much for having me. It's, of course, a pleasure to be there, especially after several trials. So you enjoyed it more when it actually comes sort of after some effort.
Yes.
So let me explain that, as you said, in plain English. First of all, the question is actually, what is capitalism? You know, people use this term a lot. You know, it's different people have different things in mind. You know, I think let's put it in a very simple way. Capitalism is an economic system where most of the economic activity is conducted with sort of tools, production, means of production, which is capital, which belongs to private individuals. It can belong to private individuals directly, or it can belong to private individuals through different, you know, societies or shares and so forth. And why? So I think that would be kind of a very simple definition of capitalism, which is a little bit different from market economy, because market economy could be an economy where actually lots of small producers use their own capital and labor together. But in capitalism, capitalists use their capital and they hire workers. So that's the difference. Now, you asked me what is different in this new so-called capitalism compared to the one that was until recently. And I think the difference is that we had really a period of high globalization where actually there was lots of exchange, lots of trade, and moreover, ideologically, it was felt that it was something which is good for all sides. Sometime, you know, whether it was after the financial crisis 2008 or maybe with Trump getting to power in 2017, or the satisfaction of the American middle class or actually Western middle classes, things have changed a bit in the sense that external relations now are more what is called mercantilist. Mercantilist is simply a word to say that now countries think about other countries more than simply enterprise versus enterprise. So they increase tariff rates. They are very skeptical about sort of selling their own technology. They are afraid maybe that the other side would use technology to make war. So, you know, suddenly political elements become more dominant.
Did we see this coming? Because it seems to me, from a political point of view, this has all been a bit of a blindsider. Everything that's happened to the USA, what's happening to the world's economy. Did the economists see this happening?
Well, you know, it depends. But honestly, I don't think that if you go back like 15 to 20 years, people were seeing that. You know, they were not seeing that because there was a very high level of optimism that actually we have reached a new stage, and that stage with no wars, with countries being sort of more likely to cooperate with each other. It didn't really matter, it was believed, whether your supply chain is in China or it's in Vietnam or in South Africa, because interest of the producers and people who actually were involved was such that actually this economic interest would overwhelm any other or dominate any other interest. So I think many people did not believe that actually the situation would move to where it is now.
Maybe we'll talk about whether that's desirable or not shortly. But
Right.
we look at the title of your book again, The Great Global Transformation. You talk about national market liberalism in a multipolar world. That's just what you've been explaining. But if you crunch it down, just for somebody that looks at that title and thinks, gosh, that's quite a big
Yes.
chunk. Can you tell us in plain English what you're trying to convey with that title?
Yeah. No, the title, this is actually subtitle, the national market liberalism is quite a mouthful. So I'm quite in agreement with you that it is quite a mouthful, and it couldn't decide for a while whether I should keep it or not. But the idea is the following: is that let's go back, as you spoke. I mean, as you said before, let's go back to like 15 years ago. In those days, you had globalization. You didn't care really who is producing what, because you believed there would be no sort of conflict, no wars, or not significant conflict. And of course, domestically, as you know, actually since the 1980s and since Thatcher and Reagan, we had neoliberalism at home, which meant privatization, deregulation, takeover of the formerly nationalized companies into private hands, and so on. Now, the argument with this national market liberalism says is the following. The adjective national indicates that liberalism now has stayed within the confines of a nation. So we do have neoliberalism continuing domestically. You see that in the US with the decrease in the top tax rates, much greater deregulation than in the past, lower role of the state. But internationally, we have moved to something that I called before, such much more adversarial position towards the rest of the world, and what I called, what many people call mercantilism. So to break it down, national means that the kind of neoliberalism stays domestically, and it's limited to the market sphere. Even in a social sphere, some of the things like affirmative action policies, equality of gender, and all of that is also shifted aside. And internationally, we have a big break. So that's the idea. It's not easy actually at first to understand, but I hope that when I explain a little bit, it is slightly more understandable.
No, it does make sense. But I'm wondering, when you're writing a book like this, and gosh, there's some big ideas, and yes, it is very pertinent to where we are right now, geopolitically and economically. Who are you writing this book for? Who do you want to be reading it?
I think it is a book that can be read by many people. It's not particularly it's not an economist book. It does have some jargon. There is a little bit of a discussion of how different writers, historically looked at the relationship between trade and peace, or trade and war, because you have divided people on that. Some people believe that actually trade, because it needs cooperation, would necessarily lead to basically peaceful relations. But others believe that the trade oftentimes uses coercive means, so it can lead to war. So to cut a long story short, I think actually everybody who is interested in the current moment and who is interested in the relations, both domestic relations in rich countries and relations especially with Asia and the rise of China, should be reading this book, or actually it should be easy for him or her to understand the book. That's what I mean.
I mean, I'm a layperson, I'm a civilian, and I'm quite scared because this seems to me quite a volatile economic environment. Am I right? Should I be worried?
Yes, it's totally volatile. It's a quite volatile environment. It's more volatile than it used to be. But there are people. I remember that many years ago I was reading Nassim Taleb's books. And Nassim Taleb has three types of individuals, countries, or people. So there are people who are very robust, which means volatility doesn't affect them very much. So volatility is up or down, they are still doing very well. There are people who are fragile, actually, to whom volatility is a bad news. But then he actually introduced a new category of anti-fragile. So these are people who actually thrive under volatility. So it's not impossible that there will be people who will thrive. If you think of the large gyrations in the stock market, there might be some people who are actually making money. And
those are the winners.
Maybe...
The ones that aren't fragile are the winners in the economy. That's the point.
Yes, that's the anti-fragile could be also people who are able to move, for example, their production out of China. They make even maybe more money by going to Vietnam. So it's not, I don't think that one can say it is lose-lose proposition throughout. However, probably you're right that losers outweigh the winners because of the uncertainty and volatility.
And we're going to see these new elites, which of course you're going to talk about as well. But there is this literally geographical shift in power from what we'll loosely call the West to Asia, China specifically, also India. I mean, that's just huge, isn't it? Again, this is a complete reset of the world order, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's especially for people of a certain generation, actually, including myself. For example, when I was young, I thought that the division of the world, I grew up in a socialist country, so I thought the division of the world of three worlds. The first world was the rich capitalist countries, the second world was poorer, but still, middle income socialist countries, and then the third world was Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And I thought that it was some kind of a, how should I say, long-term or natural distinction. But in reality, of course, after you learn a little bit of history, you realize that has been produced by the Industrial Revolution. There was no such a division in 1600. China's income on per capita basis was the same as Italy's income. Actually, the developed regions of China were actually the same. They had same income as Venice or Genoa, or Amsterdam and London later. And then you sort of now see this big change that you mentioned with the rise of Asia as essentially going back to that time around the Industrial Revolution and even before in the distribution of economic activity. So we are really going back to some extent to quote unquote a normal, usual distribution. And in that view of the history, then the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the West was to some kind an anomaly. So it's not the return of China, which is an anomaly. The anomaly was the rise of the West. So then you reread history, So
do you think we should have seen it coming then?
Yeah, we've been complacent, haven't we?
Oh, you mean, had we seen it coming?
Yeah, well, if you think about the way the West is almost reacting to the rise of China and India as if they're shocked in some places. And it makes me think, well, if they'd studied economic history, perhaps this wouldn't have been so much of a shock. And the other thing that's in my head is the hollowing out of the middle classes, and particularly because you've done so much work on inequality, that this getting the stark difference between the elites and then the people leading more fragile lives. But that bit of society in the West has been increasing in lots of countries. Whereas, I mean, so I'm based in Edinburgh. I really noticed the kind of tourists we've got now are from very different countries to the ones we had 20 years ago. And you can see it in terms of, so we've got a tram machine that sells tickets, and I was listening to them updating the number of languages on the tram machine recently. And it's a brilliant geography of the world to see where the tourists are coming from to Edinburgh at the moment.
Absolutely. I totally agree with what you're saying, is that actually that what is interesting there is that I speak of that in the book because, I work with microdata for around the world. And then what you notice is that the rise of Asia and China in particular takes place at the level of countries. So that's one issue. It's, geopolitical competition, US versus China, stuff like that. But at the level of individuals, the rise of China and India simply means that there are more people who are in some kind of global middle class and who come from those countries. And these are exactly the people whom you see in Edinburgh taking the train or flying to the UK and so on, who were not there 20 years ago. Exactly what you were
Students,
saying.
loads of students now everywhere.
And lots of students, and actually lots of tourists. Actually, I probably know that China is the largest emitter of tourists in the world currently. So that also means that in many cases, lower parts of the Western income distributions that are affected by the rise of China are losing their global income position. The top is not. The Western top is really quite far from China, but the lower parts are losing their position. And of course, people say, well, what does it mean? Because, do I know why I'm in the 70th percentile in the world of the 80s? Doesn't make any difference. However, I think gradually one learns that, because if you're at a lower position, there are certain goods that would be much less easily, how should I say, accessible to you. Like, for example, you're not going to go to the World Cup in football because the tickets will be too expensive. Or you will not go to 2 weeks vacation in Thailand. You might go to 1 week vacation somewhere closer. So, it would eventually end. For example, taking Italy, you would sell the fancy apartments that look, in Venice on a canal. You would send it to the Chinese. So, it would be eventually shown to you. You would see it, that position, as we're saying about Edinburgh. And about tourists and so forth.
Let's look at how we got here. And you say in your book that China's success came out of globalization, but you contradictorily say, is that even a word? I don't know. You say at the same time, it also helped end globalization. Can you explain that and why that was the case? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a pretty clever phrase. I was very happy about that phrase. What it meant is the following, is that China benefited tremendously from globalization and from the ability to get the American investments, American technology. And for that reason, the détente with the US, which goes back to the 1970s, was absolutely, I think, in many people's opinion, including my own, was really a necessary condition for China's success. But the China success was so big that it actually now threatened the global political economic position of the United States. And consequently, the US has an interest in stopping globalization. So that was the irony. You just became too successful. If China was a small country, let's suppose 20 million people, it would not have been a problem. 20 million people does not make much a difference. They are living well, but it's not a threat to anybody. But if it's 1.4 billion people, and they're getting richer and richer, then it becomes a problem. So in some sense, yes, China benefited from globalization, but because it benefited so much, it actually brought an end to it, not by itself, but by perception of herself from the others.
So it's outgrown the world order, but I'm wondering what you think is likely to happen next between China and USA economy. We've got tariff wars or weird shadow boxing going on there. How do you think this is going to play out? Who's going to win?
Quite honestly, nobody knows. I think if you had in your show Trump, he wouldn't know either. And if you had Xi Jinping, the two of them, if they were to tell you the truth, they wouldn't know either, because there are so many elements, including volatility of decision making on the Trump side, and it's very unclear on also Chinese reaction. But I think that one sort of broad conclusion that we can make, and that's also in the subtitle of the book, is that we are moving toward a multipolar world. And it's not something bad, and I think we have to adjust to that. And it's not only China and the US. We have Russia that now plays also a very sort of interesting role. Russia is not economically at the same level as China, but it does have, of course, military power, and it has a huge landmass. And it's also very trickily located because it's neither Europe nor Asia. Well, then you have India with now largest population in the world. So India is obviously, and with high growth rates. And then you also have the sort of middle to upper powers that are becoming more important, like Brazil, South Africa. I would not be surprised that Nigeria, which is now as what is this English term for the UK when they said that the UK is boxing below its weight, or above its weight, above. But Nigeria is definitely boxing below. So that could also be a country with much greater importance. So then if you look at the world like that, you would have maybe 5 or 6 relatively important countries, poles. They would not be all equally important, but they would play some role.
It sounds super interesting, fascinating. Is it also quite alarming that we just got no idea where anything's going anymore? It's very difficult to forecast. 5 years ahead, never mind a year ahead.
True. I agree. But as I said, one should not be, although my book has parts which are pessimistic, but one should not be totally pessimistic, because that multipolar world is not necessarily the world of war. Multipolar powers do have, technically, they do have an incentive to keep some sort of balance of power. Now we have, unfortunately, this horrible war between Russia and Ukraine, and we have the situation in Gaza, which is horrible. But hopefully, when they end, we might go into some more peaceful period with large powers, and that would probably require, and I'll stop there, but I think it would require redoing or rethinking international economic organizations and generally organizations, because, as you know, they've been created after World War II. The situation in terms of power now is very different. There is no reason, for example, that, I don't know, Belgium has more vote at the World Bank and the IMF than Nigeria. It makes no sense. And I think we have to redo that.
There's so much that's different. And if we go on to talk about elites and inequality, that's super interesting as well. A big subject for you, as Susan said. You're looking at the USA and you found a new elite, both rich and well educated. How has that changed politics?
I think that particular, I'll explain that new elite in a second, but I think that new elite is really characteristic for most rich countries. US is always a little bit ahead, partly because the developments there are faster and it's a bigger country, so it's actually more easily observable. But the idea is the following. It is simply an empirical fact. Whether one agrees, likes it or doesn't like, doesn't make any difference. The empirical fact is that there is an increasing percentage among rich people, let's take 10% who are the richest, who are at the same time among richest capitalists, meaning they are really at the top of income distribution by capital ownership, and they are also at the top of earnings distribution. So this is really unusual. It's unusual historically because in the past you had rich capitalists, but rich capitalists did not work as workers, or they were not CEOs, they were not doctors, they were not lawyers. And nowadays you have the two things combined, and one about 3% of the US population, for I think UK is about 2%, are really in that very special group that they're richest capitalists and richest workers. And that's something new.
And what about, is that comparable with China's ruling class? Is that different in many ways, or similar?
China also has that, but in case of China, I did some different work with the Chinese co-authors. We really focus a little bit differently. We focused on the change in the top 5% elite, because this is really kind of obvious, but 1988, when we have the first data, and the last one, 2023. In 1988, among the Chinese elite, you had basically people who were state-owned enterprises, bosses, directors, engineers, so-called workers, because they treat even engineers technically as workers, and you had practically no private capitalists or self-employed or professional managerial class, very little. Well, you move like 35 years later, what you find is that 60% of people there and more than 60% of income there comes from the private sector in the elite. So the elite now is composed of small capitalists, large capitalists, professional managerial class, most of them working in the private companies. And of course, you have state-owned enterprises, directors, and others. But they play now a subsidiary role, whereas like 35 years ago, they were really the dominant group. So that was a very rapid transformation. And just to finish, give an example from the work by Bob Allen, an English economic historian. He finds the rise of the capitalist class in the UK in the 19th century to have taken almost 100 years in terms of size. And in China, it has happened over 35 or 40 years. So it's much faster developed.
Goodness, you've
I
conscripted.
have this one there, Branko's previous book, if anyone wants to
Yes,
go into that in more detail.
exactly. That's where Bob Allen actually has the what is called intensive and extensive development of the British capitalist class from Adam Smith, 1776 until, for example, Marx 1867. So it took a long time, but in China it was like really compressed.
Turbocharged. Just amazing, absolutely amazing. I want to go back to national market liberalism if I can. And you've kind of told us what it is, because you say it's ousting neoliberalism, and you better remind us, and you did give us a definition of neoliberalism. Just to be clear, what do we mean by national market liberalism and neoliberalism? I can't even speak anymore.
Too many words. Yes.
Go ahead. So I'm looking for basically what the two definitions and what's the difference.
Right. Yes, I will do that. But before that, can I just say something more about China, which is actually quite cool. So we did also the work by looking at this top 5% and looking at Communist Party membership, because believe it or not, they give you for each individual whether he or she is CPC member or not. And what we find is that CPC membership is particularly valuable in terms of income for the rich capitalists. So you have really this paradoxical situation that the Communist Party membership is valuable for rich capitalists, which of course makes sense, because obviously then they have better connections, they get more profitable projects, more profitable jobs, and so on. So that was about China and the elite in China. Now, for the definitions, it's hard. People say, what is neoliberalism? There are many definitions. The definition of capitalism, I think, is much clearer. Neoliberalism is essentially, let's make it like that. It is Thatcher plus Reagan. Okay, so you don't need to explain much more. We have already said all the things about tax rate, about deregulation, anti-trade unions. Reduce the importance of the trade unions, suppress them if you can. All the stuff that actually happened in England with Margaret Thatcher coming to power, and also later with Reagan. And the national market liberalism is simply saying that particular combination that we just called Thatcher/Reagan remains only domestically in the market area, but doesn't exist anymore, or is changed internationally. So that's all. Margaret Thatcher, for example, and Reagan were very keen on international cooperation, on actually low tariff rates. Recently Trump got mad when they showed Reagan speaking against tariffs. So this was the policy: reduce tariffs, actually open the capital market, which in those days was closed. So that part of Thatcher Reaganism is kind of gone. So that's what I mean. So you say national market. You made me think about this. It's maybe better to say it like that. National market liberalism is Thatcher/Reaganism without the external sector openness, without the openness of the external sector.
So is the USA and is China, are they both examples of this new model, or maybe slightly different, but examples nevertheless?
They're a little bit different, because really this new market liberalism, in my mind, really was something that I believe fits the US and maybe fits UK and to some extent France and so on. I'm not sure really that it fits China. When I discuss China, I discuss it differently. I discuss it as a basically state capitalism, and it's a little bit different. And actually, ironically, as we know, China is now more a supporter of this old-fashioned globalization than the US, and it is a supporter because it has worked very well for China. So it's obvious that they would be supporting it.
That's what a strange world we're in. But do you think globalization has actually peaked now? Are we heading for a world of economic blocks? That's what we're looking at.
Yes, that's what I'm afraid a little bit. We do see a movement towards that. We saw it particularly under Biden, because they actually were thinking, if you look, limiting Chinese IPOs, limiting sales of so-called sensitive technology, and that was the idea that was actually promoted by a foreign Financial Times economist, Rana Farrokhar, speaking of friend shoring. This is interesting. So not outsourcing to anybody but friend. So creating like countries that are friendly, as they call it, also like-minded nations. And then these like-minded nations would trade among each other. So that's the idea. Now, of course, they don't like to call these blocs because blocs have a bad connotation. But in reality, were this to happen, of course, they are blocs. This is like UK had, the Commonwealth preferences in the 1930s. Japan had the co-prosperity zone. Communist countries had Comecon. But these guys don't want to call it blocs because it sounds bad, but they call it friend shoring. But I think it has kind of a little bit fallen out of favor recently. But it could happen.
No, I'm wondering, and you have kind of answered this, but again, just to be clear, you've told me not to get hysterical about it, basically, because I've said new multipolar capitalism sounds quite threatening, but does it make the world safer or more unstable? I mean, I'm thinking, oh, it's more unstable maybe, but you're saying don't panic.
Yeah, exactly. No, it does make it, it makes it more unstable. But then you ask the following question. What is the value of stability? You can have a dictatorship which is stable. Is this, I mean, it is a value actually because it's stable. You don't have to worry about certain things, but maybe that's not such a great idea. Likewise, you had quite a lot of stability after that, after the end of the Cold War, where the US was really unchallenged leader economically, politically, and very importantly, ideologically. So they were not challenging anything. But that world was really, how should I say, it's not to everybody's liking. And so that world, to some extent, if you wanted really to think a little bit longer term, had to come to an end simply because the world is just way too complicated a place that you would have only one way of doing things. That was really the end of history. Liberal capitalism and everybody would become. But there are different countries, there are different political cultures. Not everybody will become the same.
Yes, is that right, Claire? Sorry, I know you've got so many questions, but I've got some too. I'm really interested in, you've done so much work looking back at history, and I'm interested in the fact that it feels like not enough people were paying attention to the fact that the world could become more unstable. But I then connect that to the fact that what happens in the world in future might depend on who's got the resources to make the things that people want made. And the distribution of those is not even across the world. So, China has a lot of the rare earth minerals that are going to be really needed. And I wonder if that's going to end up either creating more disruption or ending up creating more stability, because people are going to have to get on with the nations that have got the resources that other people want. And I wonder if actually we should be prepared for more disruption ahead of a time of stability, or does that feel wrong compared with what you've learned from history?
No, I think you're right, but I would, how should I say, I think there is a pessimistic take and an optimistic take. The pessimistic take, I totally agree with you. The distribution of resources is uneven, and of course, countries will fight for those resources. And oftentimes, that actually has happened in the past, you will need to have a political control over the country which does have that resources, or you are always afraid whether actually that resource might be actually sold to somebody else or taken by somebody else. On the other hand, we should not underestimate our ability to create new resources and to solve problems. Nobody, for example, thought of shale, like 30 years ago that nobody thought that the US would become net exporter of energy while it was in 1974 a huge importer. And oil, of course, power still exists, but the oil power in the 1970s by the countries like Saudi Arabia was enormous. So I think things can change. Technological development can make certain things sort of obsolete or can replace them and so on. So I'm not deterministically minded when it comes to natural resources.
So the other thing that might come from the outside is disruption as a result of climate change, and
Yes.
which countries in the world are going to be affected by that. If those are the countries then with resources, it kind of makes you wonder how much are people looking at dealing with all the trade and tariffs and things that are going on now versus what might be coming down the line in 5 to 10 years' time, because we now know that the feedback loops on climate change are happening much faster than when
Right.
were originally anticipated.
No, we do have all of this. I mean, they're like all of these challenges that you mentioned, actually. First, the climate change. Secondly, different resources, because these resources, why we talk about the rare earth now, and we didn't talk before, we talk because of the development of all these sort of new technologies where the rare earth is being used. Now, there could be some other new technologies that are going to use something else that we don't know what it would be. So then the distribution of that particular mineral would determine also power. So I think there are many unknowns. But as I said, on optimistic take, I don't think this is something totally new. We always had a situation. In the past, it used to be sugar, then it was cotton, then you had all kinds of things that are historically, location of which was historically determined. And of course, people fought about that. So we are going still to continue fighting for these resources. There is no doubt about that.
Well, thanks for reminding us of that and give us a context as well, because I think we forget all that, don't we? So thank you, Susan, as well for flinging that in. We're getting towards...
The advantage of globalization was that the fight oftentimes was limited to a financial fight, so it did not necessarily involve a control. But now, since we are moving to a little bit different, it will be a control. I don't know if you know, actually, it just occurred to me, I think that I mentioned in the footnote, think of, there was a book by an English writer. It was called Pascalis Island, and it was made into a movie. And I think the name of the writer was Unworth, I think, or something. And that's a story, turn of the century, 19th century, turn of the 20th century. And this is really fighting for resources in today's Turkey, then Turkey and today's Turkey, between basically British and the English. And it all comes like they're all exploring the terrain. They have each domestic allies. So the British work with one group of people, the Germans work with another. It's very similar to, I think, what we are seeing today. It could be today in Angola rather than Turkey, but the idea is the same.
I'm going to look that up now. Definitely, that's one for the reading list. I've got two final questions for you because we don't want to take up too much of your time now. If you could give, this is really simple, one piece of advice to global leaders, Branko, what would it be?
Don't do wars.
Don't do wars. Okay.
I think that's a strong enough.
I think that's a reasonable request. I would like to
do everything else but wars.
So how, if their goal is to not do wars, how would they better avoid them, given this where we are now at the moment? Obviously, end the ones that are going on quicker.
I think the governments actually, when they want to do certain things, they have lots of means. They can actually subvert other governments, they can bribe people, they can influence people, they can do economic coercion, all of these things that I don't like particularly. But I think all of them are better than wars, because wars are actually, the objective of wars is the destruction of people and property and country, and everything else is actually less destructive than wars. So I think we should we definitely should, in my opinion, we should be definitely against wars, but not be, how should I say, not be so silly and or of sunny disposition to believe that no other means of coercion would be used. The states use other means of coercion, but these means, in my opinion, are much less sort of destructive than the use of sheer military power.
So we're not doing wars. That's good. But
yeah.
A big UK question for you here. What would you say to Rachel Reeves, our Chancellor of the Exchequer, because she's got an upcoming budget? The advice would be, given all the stuff you've laid out for us and all the historical, stuff that we can learn from, what should she be doing now?
Well, this is a question I won't answer. I've answered all your questions, but that one, I think one needs to know much more about the current, not only the current states of the UK, but also the finances, the different interest groups, the fighting about the resources, and many other problems that I know the UK is facing. But I know them from the newspapers, but I cannot really say anything else.
A hellishly difficult job balancing a budget.
It is a difficult job.
I think
going back to where you've spent so many years researching, Branko, with focusing on inequality, would you urge politicians around the world to pay attention to that?
I think they are actually paying attention, at least they are verbally saying they're paying attention much more than 15 years ago. But it is a difficult problem. You cannot solve it. First of all, it is a problem that arises and is being solved in an extremely slow manner. The income distribution does not, grow by leaps and jumps. It goes like the grass grows, and it grows and grows, and then at one point you see, well, the grass is too high, and then you want to bring it down, and it also takes time to bring it down. So it is not an easy thing to do. I think they are much more aware of that, but of course there are political pressures, there are political groups, there are different ideologies, there are people who actually do not tell to you, okay, I am in favor of greater inequality as such, but they say, okay, I'm in favor of low taxation on capital, because if you don't tax my capital, I'm going to invest. If I invest, I'm going to hire more workers, and then everybody would be better off. And it doesn't happen exactly like that. What happens maybe that you got a very low tax and then you become rich, and the other people, you don't hire them and they become poor. So it's very difficult to actually, how should I say, it's difficult to deal with inequality. There are means, we know them, but they are very often either crude, like for example, tax everything that moves, that's very crude and it's not going to work. And there are other means that actually take a long time, like social mobility, education. This is not done in 2 years. It's done over a whole generation, or actually even 2 generations.
And politically, it's really difficult because you're not
politically seeing it's difficult.
Yeah, exactly.
But on the other hand, it has been done. It's also true. If you look at actually, particularly Western countries after World War II until 1980, that was a period, or almost, we should not really sort of embellish that period because there were also many other issues, but it was true that actually inequality was reduced significantly, and then became, actually we know that for the UK, for the US, actually the lowest level was just around 1978, 79, 1980. And after that it went up, and in the UK now in the last few years it actually went down. People don't know that, but it did actually go down in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Oof, fascinating, wide-ranging conversation. The book, it's all in the book. Read the book, everyone. Branko, thank you so much for joining us.
The book is better than my conversation.
No, it's not. Your conversation brought the book to life, but the book is I really enjoyed it, and particularly reflecting on things we haven't touched on today, but that link between the rise of elites. And I was particularly thinking about, you mentioned the elites in the UK, but we had some very rich people putting a lot of money to make Brexit happen. And then they gambled on the stock market in order to benefit more from the disruption that occurred. And I think we don't talk enough about that sort of thing. So anyone interested in that, definitely do read the book. Claire, I think it's down to me to wrap up now, isn't it? So I'm really sorry that our time today has come to an end. I have so many more questions, and I'm sure our audience listening will. So
we can do it another time.
I think we need to do it again, Branko. Once you're back safely in America, and then we've got North, and we'll definitely speak to you when your next book comes out. Do you know what your next book is yet?
No. Well, let's speak about this one second time. Don't wait for my second book.
No, right. And we'll focus on elites next time, I think, because there's so much more that we've not touched on today. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm just going to thank the audience, Branko. You can catch up with our past recordings on YouTube and share them with your friends. The David Hume Institute has just released, or we're about to release, the results of our next Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. So they will be on our website soon, and the event for that is at the end of November. Please remember we're a charity, and we can only continue to bring you new research and thought-provoking events as a result of donations from our supporters. So the details of how to donate are on our website. And then last but not least, it's to thank everyone, including Branko and Claire, for the lively discussion. And until next time, cheerio, everybody.
Bye-bye.